In this video, I will be discussing and performing a suite in G minor by Dietrich Buxtehude. This suite is assigned the number 242 in Buxtehude's catalogue of works and has four movements, namely Allemande, Courante, Sarabande, and Gigue. Incidentally, I posted a video performance of this suite a couple of weeks ago, link in the video description, but the audio recording in this video is a different performance. This suite was never published during Buxtehude's lifetime and survives in one manuscript known as the Ryge tablature, dating from 1712 and now belonging to the Danish Royal Library. The manuscript contains several suites and variations by Buxtehude, along with keyboard works by other composers, and the music is notated in tablature form. This is a type of notation we more commonly associate with instruments such as the lute, but keyboard tablature was not uncommon during the 17th and early 18th century, especially in Germany, and as a matter of fact, many of Buxtehude's keyboard works survive only in that type of notation. While it is beyond the scope of this video to discuss keyboard tablature, let me show you for a moment a page from the manuscript so that you can see what this type of notation looks like. So here you see one page from the Ryge tablature, and you see the Sarabande and the Gigue. Now, I want to explain here that when it comes to this type of keyboard tablature, usually the music is spread along two pages. So what happens here, in other words, is that you see the beginning of the Sarabande going almost to the end of the first section, and then the next page, in other words, the right-hand page, would have the remainder of the Sarabande. Now, you can't see that. I've only included one page, so what you see is, as I said, most of the first section of the Sarabande and then portions of the Gigue. But the reason I did this is because I wanted to show you just one page. If I showed you both, then it would be a little more difficult to see, especially if you're looking at this at a computer screen. Now, what is happening here, as I mentioned, I can't really explain how it all works because it would take some time and it would take away from the main purpose of this video. But just so you have an idea of what you see there, basically the letters that you see indicate pitches, and then if you see any added stems or loops around the letters, these indicate accidentals, and then the beams above the notes indicate the rhythm. Let's look now at different aspects of interpretation, beginning with some remarks concerning tempo. I would say that in terms of technical demands, Buxtehude's suites in general are not particularly challenging, especially when compared to the far better known suites of later composers such as Johann Sebastian Bach. This technical simplicity, so to speak, is further reinforced by the modest proportions of the suites, both in terms of the number of movements as well as the duration of the individual movements themselves. I suspect that these admittedly superficial characteristics are probably responsible for the fact that Buxtehude's harpsichord music is generally overlooked, but the music's real beauty and interpretive challenges lie underneath the seemingly uncomplicated surface. Another byproduct of this simple exterior is that, at least judging from some of the available recordings of Buxtehude's harpsichord music, some performers apparently approach this music as lighter fare, and it is not uncommon for certain movements to be performed a little too fast, perhaps as a way of making the music sound more exciting. I'm sure you're familiar with the notion that Baroque composers did not usually include tempo indications in their scores, and that in general, Baroque scores do not contain many performance indications. This is not entirely true. It's just that Baroque scores are meant to be approached and read a little differently compared to the way many modern musicians have been trained to read music. For instance, when a composer labels a movement as a particular dance type, this already provides the performer with a lot of information regarding tempo, character, and even articulation. And even if such dance movements were not meant to be literally danced, they should certainly evoke the character and feel of a particular dance. Let's see how these considerations apply to the Allemande in Buxtehude's G minor suite, starting with choosing a tempo. While obviously there is no single correct tempo, Allemandes certainly fall within a particular range of tempos. My approach is to concentrate on the bass line, or at least the left hand, and more specifically on the eighth notes. While the quarter note is the unit of the beat, I prefer to concentrate on the eighth notes for two reasons. First, it's easier for me to conceive of an appropriate tempo when I think of the eighth notes being played at a walking pace and creating a moderately flowing movement. Secondly, there is a particular articulation involving a group of two eighth notes for each beat, with the first eighth note being long and connected to the second eighth note, while the second eighth note is short. Let me demonstrate what I mean, and what I would like to do. The suite that I'm playing, the G minor suite, is not particularly good as a means of demonstration because it doesn't have too many series of these eighth notes. So I want to demonstrate by using a different suite by Buxtehude. This is one of his C major suites, the Allemande from the C major suite. This particular one has the catalog number 230. So let me play the opening. I will play both hands, and then I will show you what I mean in terms of the eighth notes. But you may want to start concentrating on what the left hand is doing anyway. So what is happening in the left hand is this. So we start with 16th notes, and then we have these eighth notes. I am exaggerating the effect a little bit so you can see what I'm doing, but in general you can tell that I am holding the first one to the second one and then lifting. And I'm not saying that this is the correct tempo or anything like that, but I always think in this range where my eighth notes have this kind of flowing motion. And I can apply this now if I'm thinking of these eighth notes. They're not as obviously placed in the G minor suite, but I can think of this kind of tempo. So this is why I think of eighth notes. It helps me kind of establish this kind of walking pace that I think is an appropriate tempo for an Allemande. Another characteristic of this Allemande and the suite in general is that it is very chordally conceived. This in itself is not necessarily unusual, as Baroque music tends to be harmonically based. However, in this particular instance, the texture itself is primarily based on chords. And when I played the beginning just a couple of minutes ago, you probably noticed that all of these are just chords. So it is very, very much based on chords, the entire texture. This also means, by the way, holding down notes belonging to the same chord. This is an instance of not playing literally what's in the score. Sometimes you may see some slurs underneath these chords, but sometimes not. And of course, it depends on the performer how much to do it. But what I mean is that instead of doing this, I do this. And again, it depends on the discretion of the performer, how much this effect is going to be done. In terms of its rhythmic profile, the Allemande contains a continuous stream of 16th notes, and therefore it is very important to provide variety both through rhythmic flexibility and by giving individual gestures a distinctive shape. Let's look first at rhythmic flexibility, and what I would basically say here is something that I've mentioned in previous videos, where note values are not meant to be interpreted literally, which means that in this particular case, not all 16th notes are the same, and everything really depends on their position within the beat. So when I'm starting this Allemande, like I did before, instead of playing everything literally 16th notes, I tend to think of the first 16th note, which is on the strong beat, as lasting a little longer than the remaining ones, so that I give a little lilt, let's say, to the music. So instead of this, I do this. So the first one is longer, and the others a little faster to fill out the entire beat. And you can do the same thing, not with every beat, because you need to provide variety, but again, a slight lengthening sometimes of important notes within this 16th notes runs. So instead of the literal approach, and I hope you can tell the difference between the two versions that I just played. And now let's look at shaping individual gestures. For my examples, I will concentrate on the opening measures of the second section of the Allemande, and let me play it for a moment, and then I will tell you what I'm doing in terms of the gestures. So what is happening here, I would say, is that we have a lot of these gestures or ideas, musical ideas if you want to think of them that way, that begin a 16th note after the beat. So we have a 16th note rest, and then there are a couple of of different ones here. We start with an ascending one. And then we have one that has a leap. Here's the leap. And then we have a different one, this one. So what am I going to do? I have three different gestures here. They're all fairly similar. But what I try to do is I think of the first one as kind of flowing towards the next beat. Now when I get to the other one, the one that has the leap, I'm going to actually lengthen this note. So the first one goes like this. The second one. And I hope you can tell the difference. Again, I'm exaggerating a little bit so you can hear it. And then for the third one, I'm going to try to play these 16th notes, kind of delay the beginning of the gesture so that then I have to play the gesture itself much faster than a regular 16th note. So let me start a little earlier so that you can tell what I'm doing. Okay, and here it comes. And let me play the whole passage one more time. Again, I might exaggerate a little bit the effect so that you can hear it, and it's going to be a little more subtle in the actual performance. And you can tell that this way there is this wonderful expressive variety to this music. And this is what I said before, that it may seem simple on the surface, but when you start actually looking at these gestures and trying to find ways to express them individually, then suddenly you realize that this music is much more complicated below the surface than what it initially seems like. Let's move on to the Sarabande. And the first thing I would like to say is that we have a regular phrase structure. As is usual with these dance movements, we have two sections, and each section contains 8 measures and is further subdivided into 2 phrases of 4 measures each. I think it is important to make these divisions audible to the listener, but without breaking the flow of the music. So instead of kind of doing a ritardando towards the end of each phrase, the way I like to think of it is more in terms of a very subtle deceleration right before the final chord of the phrase, and then a slight hesitation between the final chord and the first chord of the new phrase. Let me show you what I mean by this, and I will go ahead and start the Sarabande, and then I will tell you what is happening at the end of the first phrase. So what happened there, the end of the phrase was this one, and the beginning of the next phrase is this. And what I'm doing is slightly decelerating at the very end, so something like this. And then a little hesitation. And I'm going to do the same thing now at the end of the next phrase. And a little hesitation. And as As always, I exaggerated the effect a little bit just so that you could hear it, but I hope you could tell exactly what I was doing. It's going to be a little more subtle in the actual performance, but again, this is the way I kind of try to separate the phrases from one another and make the end of one phrase and the beginning of the next phrase audible to the listener. Another expressive device I would like to mention is called dislocation, which denotes that the two hands are not completely in sync with each other. In other words, they do not play together. Depending on the context, dislocation can be used for different purposes. For instance, since subtle dynamic gradations on the harpsichord are very much dependent on how a performer exploits the resonance of the instrument, not playing hands together can create a slightly softening effect compared to playing all the notes at the same time. Dislocation is not an effect that can be precisely quantified, and ultimately it is up to the performer to decide how much to use it depending on the type of expressive effect they want to create. When you listen to my performance of the suite while following the score, you will notice it more prominently in the Allemande. Usually pieces in a moderate or slower tempo present more opportunities for its use. Here, I want to highlight how dislocation can aid in heightening the expressivity of a particular moment by delaying the expected arrival of a melodic note. The example I have in mind occurs in the first section of the Gigue, so let's take a look at it now. The first thing I want to do is actually play from the beginning of the Gigue to that moment, and then I will kind of isolate it and show you what I'm doing. And I'm going to play everything a little more slowly so that you actually have time to hear what is happening. Now, the passage, or rather the moment that I'm thinking, is this one. And I exaggerated what I did so that you could hear it, and I hope you actually heard it also when I played that passage. Now, what is happening here is this, that we are getting to the highest melodic note, because if you remember, we started here. So this is a very, very expressive moment, and we want to heighten that expressivity. So what I'm doing is I'm delaying the arrival of that E flat, but what I'm also doing at the same time is that I am keeping the left hand, or at least the other musical lines, happening exactly where they are supposed to be happening rhythmically. In other words, you can think of the left hand as staying in a more strict rhythmic profile, while the right hand there becomes freer. So again, let me show you what I'm doing. So the left hand stays strict, and the right hand, and again, both of them together. And you can do this in other parts of the Gigue. For example, I do it a little further down when I get to the end of the first section, and we have this kind of passage. So I do it with that D right there. And again, the other musical lines are staying rhythmically constant. They actually follow the rhythm that they're supposed to have. And then I am delaying the right hand melody. And this kind of dislocation actually heightens, I would say, the expressivity of such passages. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.